Back to the book, moving forward. And this is going to go back into the shelling. And I almost wasn't going to talk about this, but I had to. There was nothing subtle or intimate about the approach and explosion of an artillery shell. When I heard the whistle of an approaching one in the distance, every muscle in my body contracted. I braced myself in a puny effort to keep from being swept away. I felt utterly helpless. As the fiendish whistle grew louder, my teeth ground against each other, my heart pounded, my mouth dried, my eyes narrowed, sweat poured over me. My breath came in short, irregular gasps, and I was afraid to swallow lest I choke. I always prayed, sometimes out loud. Under certain conditions of range and terrain, I could hear the shell approaching from a considerable distance, thus prolonging the suspense into seemingly unending torture. At the instant the voice of the shell grew the loudest, it terminated in a flash and a deafening explosion, similar to the crash of a loud clap of thunder. The ground shook and the concussion hurt my ears. Shell fragments tore the air apart as they rushed out, whirring and ripping. Rocks and dirt clattered onto the deck as smoke of the exploded shell dissipated. And this is something I need to point out. When I before I was ever in combat and ever saw what mortars really did, when you think of shrapnel, when people think of shrapnel, like how big do you think a piece of shrapnel is? Just take a guess.
This big.
So Echo's
like inch and a half, 2 inches.
Echo's holding up 1.5 inches, 2 inches. I actually thought smaller than that. I thought, you know what? It's a little tiny thing. You got to be scared. You got to watch out these little tiny things. On bigger artillery shells or mortar shells, the frag that comes off of them is 1/2 inch thick, and it can be 9 inches long, 12 inches long, jagged shards of metal. They're just evil.
Dang.
And that's why what's scary is the shrapnel. Oh yeah, it can hit you and like puncture you like a bullet, but it can also take your leg clean off or take your arm clean off or just completely, just kill you instantly if it hits you in the torso. But it's a limb remover.
Yeah.
So it's much more horrifying than what I ever envisioned it to be.
Yeah.
And the reason, one of the reasons this sticks in my mind so well is getting mortared. We were in Combat Outpost Falcon in downtown Ramadi, and we took some 120 millimeter mortar shells in there. And we, the company commander, who is an awesome, unbelievable guy, he brought in a piece of frag. And the thing, I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I was shocked at how huge it was.
What do you mean a piece of frag? Like a random piece of...
Yeah, a piece of frag that had come off the mortar shells. Yeah,
Dang.
it blew off and, bounced down the street, didn't hit anybody.
Yeah.
And he picked it up and brought it in and said, here's what's flying around the air.
Wait, so are these things that they load into the shell on purpose, or it's just
the shell is
trash of
encased in metal, and that's what the metal's for. When it blows up, it just rips apart and gets people.
Yeah, you think when you see on TV about these, I don't know, these criminals or whatever, they set pipe bombs and they put stuff,
nails,
usually
and stuff
nail
in there,
screws.
right? Yeah.
You'd think so. This is like that times 10.
Yeah, it's big and it's freaking horrifying.
Dang.
That's another one. I remember one of those same situations. We got hit with some mortars in Cop Falcon, and Leif and his team were like 300 meters away on a rooftop of a building, and frag landed on them. Dang. It wasn't. It didn't have the velocity to hurt anybody, but it was raining down on them.
Yeah.
So
it's probably all hot too.
Oh
it
yeah,
cooks you.
Yeah, horrible. Back to the book. To be under a barrage of prolonged shelling simply magnified all the terrible physical and emotional effects of one shell. To me, artillery was an invention of hell. The onrushing whistle and scream of the big steel package of destruction was the pinnacle of violent fury and the embodiment of pent-up evil. It was the essence of violence and of man's inhumanity to man. I developed a passionate hatred for shells. To be killed by a bullet seemed so clean and surgical. But shells would not only tear and rip the body, they tortured one's mind almost beyond the brink of sanity. After each shell, I was wrung out, limp and exhausted. During prolonged shelling, I often had to restrain myself and fight back a wild, inexorable urge to scream, to sob, and to cry. As Peleliu dragged on, I feared that if I ever lost control of myself under shell fire, my mind would be shattered. I hated shells as much for their damage to the mind as to the body. To be under heavy shell fire was to me by far the most terrifying combat experiences. Each time it left me feeling more forlorn and helpless, more fatalistic, and with less confidence that I could escape the dreadful law of averages that reduced our numbers. Fear is many-faceted and has many subtle nuances, but the terror and desperation endured under heavy shelling are by far the most unbearable. And I think, again, the key point of that, if you want to take something from that and apply it to life, because most people that are listening to this podcast won't have to endure shelling, other than those troopers that are out there on the front lines today. God bless them. Those guys are out there. They may have to deal with this, and they will. But for civilians, for normal people, it's the feeling of helplessness. It's the feeling of lack of control that makes it so horrifying. And so when you come up against things that you cannot control, that's something to recognize. That it is something that you cannot control, and that's what's scaring you. Mm-hmm. That's what the fear is coming from, and making it infinitely worse than something that you can control.
Yeah.